Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. If the state of California were a commodity traded on stock exchanges, it would surely be considered a leading indicator of the American future. The Golden State has always held a special mythic place in the imagination of Americans. There, the American dream could not only be realized in all of its dimensions, but also projected in glowing technicolor to a world that, whether awed or disapproving, was always fascinated. Today, California represents another frontier. With a land area larger than Britain's and the world's 8th largest economy, California may well be the main international frontier of the United States. Its southern border opens onto Mexico and the rich diversity of Latin America. Its coastline looks across the Pacific to the economic and cultural wealth of Asia. The state is a magnet for immigration and a powerhouse of human talent, material resources, and institutional depth. To be sure, California has its constraints and challenges. But for this eternal land of opportunity, embracing its international role in a globalized world is the key to a prosperous 21st century. My guest is Abraham Lowenthal, author of Global California, Rising to the Cosmopolitan Challenge. Abe Lowenthal, welcome to Dialogue.
Thanks very much, George.
It's great to have you, Abe. Let me hold up this fine book, and it is a fine book indeed, so that all may see it, and we hope get to read it. In fact, Abe, I have to say at the start, I read this book with a tremendous sense of discovery. This is not the California I thought I knew. It's a state so rich in talent. I love these kinds of details. It's the Nobel laureates from California are second only to those produced by the entire United States. And the state is so wealthy that its 2007 GDP surpassed Canada, Brazil, Russia, India, and Korea. It's obviously a powerhouse, and yet, and this I suppose is the first question, Abe, it seems to be lagging in one very important particular, and that is mobilizing to meet its international potential. Therefore, I'm wondering, is that the cosmopolitan challenge that you are alluding to that led you to write this book?
Yes, George, you're absolutely right that California has tremendous power of various sorts. Technological, it's the leading edge in so many aspects of the economy, intellectual, political, demographic. And it has tremendous number of international connections and international stakes, but it has lagged in understanding its international interests and in understanding that it can do something to advance them and that it's important to do so.
Yeah.
Of course, one of the reasons why this is so is that the sort of mindset, the way of thinking about what to do has always been that the international relations, foreign policy is something which is done by the federal government in Washington. And people in California stay as far away from the federal government in Washington as they can. And they concentrate historically on business, on lifestyle, or what have you. One of the points is that the world has changed so much in the last 30, 40 years. So much of what drives every aspect of daily life is international,
right,
in the moving forces, that it's very anachronistic to think, oh, well, that's something we don't concern ourselves with. You take, for example, the workings of the economy, what provides jobs and prosperity to Californians. It depends on what's happening in the international economy.
Exactly.
The two leading growth sectors in California, for example, Silicon Valley and Hollywood, get a majority of their revenue abroad. And that's true in a number of other sectors. But we haven't thought about it in those terms.
You know, that is a superb answer, Abe, and the answer, like the book, are very lucid and easy to follow, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And the way I interpret what you just said, and the tone of this book is, and I use almost a musical term, that California should, as I put it, find its own voice in the sense of its international relationship. And here's the second question that flows from that, Abe. It seems to me what you're advocating is not a competition with Washington or the East Coast for foreign policy prominence. I shouldn't lead the question this way, but are you saying that when California does that, when it coordinates its international interests better, takes its positions more coherently, that will in turn influence and perhaps enrich our overall foreign policy? Will it contribute to it?
I'm very glad you put it that way, because sometimes when people hear that I've done a book on global California and the very concept of the book, they say, no, you know, California can't go off in its own direction. This is not a call for California to have an independent foreign policy that is contradictory to the rest of the United States. And as you undoubtedly know, that's constitutionally impossible in any case. The Supreme Court has ruled that even very modest steps taken by states to directly pursue a foreign policy of their own violate the supremacy of the federal government. But think about the national interest, which is the fundamental concept people have in mind in Washington and elsewhere when we think about our international relations. What is the national interest? Historically, without really thinking about it, we tend to assume that something which is understood and defined in Washington may be somewhere between New York and Washington, between the financial community and the political leadership, that it's interpretable and understood by a priestly tribe of experts that go into government to take care of protecting the national interest.
Right.
Now, actually, as you well know, the national interest is not engraved on tablets of stone that are decipherable only by a priestly tribe. The national interest is what the political process of the country defines as important. And in that sense, California has not been pulling its own weight. It has not really contributed to the formation of national objectives in a sufficient way. And this can be seen in a number of ways. You take relations with China, for example. Historically, the foreign policy sort of establishment of the East Coast has thought of China essentially in terms of threat and security.
Right.
Those in California who pay attention to China, and there actually are quite a few, have thought of California for years in terms of business and opportunity.
And population.
Population too, but opportunity, thinking of ways to build the ties, to build the connections.
Right.
Take Mexico. I remember that a surrogate of one of the presidential campaigns came out to California and spoke in a forum that I was involved in, and talked about what the foreign policy of the administration he was representing, the would-be administration, would be. And he talked for 35 minutes without mentioning the word Mexico. If you live in California, you understand what is finally becoming understood in Washington, which is that the relationship with Mexico is fundamentally important for the United States in so many respects.
All this is true, Abe, and you know there's another point to this that flows from what you've said that I felt, well, to be honest with it, a little bit guilty about as I read this book, and that is how parochial we on the East Coast have been about foreign policy, and that to the extent that California takes a more coherent and expressive voice in these matters, it'll help balance this a kind of an East Coast dominance, if you will, that, you know, all the wisdom in the world certainly does not reside in the Boston-Washington corridor, as we well know. Abe, I want to ask you a question now also about the other side of the picture, though, because you're also honest in this book, and as you have to be, because there's another California, which is not without its problems. Crime, poverty, pollution, illiteracy, particularly among some of the larger masses of recent immigrants were experiencing some degree of this problem. And I guess the question here is, Abe, to the extent that California takes your advice, does what it should do, coordinates its many voices into something more unified on international subjects and positions, what effect, if any, will that have on these problems? Or will it be a way, or could it be a way of avoiding them, sort of, you know, switching the game?
Let me make 2 points, if I could, in responding to your question and also to the last thing you said. First, on the last thing you said, yes, there's been some parochialism on the Atlantic coast of thinking of California as something remote and exotic that doesn't really count in the formulation of the national policy. But of course, the principal point of the book is that there's been parochialism in California, that we are in California a tremendous world center in so many respects, but we have parochial attitudes. We don't think of ourselves as a power center, and that's really what the book is aimed at. Although I do suggest that we should contribute to the national policy process by trying to formulate more of a voice, particularly through our large congressional delegation, obviously the largest congressional delegation in the country and very well placed. Most of what we ought to be doing in California is not unifying one voice, but rather in our respective areas, in business and non-governmental organizations, in Hollywood, in the universities, in the labor unions, and so on, being conscious of what we have at stake internationally and pursuing our interest in an intelligent and responsive way. And in that sense, a really central aspect of the book, which is developed in one of the chapters, is precisely, this is not a booster book. This is not a traditional California, we are great kind of book. It's a book that says we in California have a lot at stake in our international relationships. For better and for worse, there are challenges and difficulties as well as opportunities. So in the fourth chapter, I deal with three of those as by example. The first is, how do we use policy to assure that we will get as much benefit as possible from international global engagement, but also recognize that there are costs and risks and stresses engaged with global interest in global engagement. How do we manage, mitigate, and compensate for those? Similarly with immigration, which is a hot topic nationally from time to time. California has a lot of experience with that. It's crucially important to think of immigration not as something that we either welcome on the one hand or condemn on the other, same with globalization, but rather how do we maximize the benefit, mitigate, compensate for, manage the risks and stresses. And similarly, our relationship with Mexico. So it is crucially important for public health, for education, for youth gangs, for all kinds of aspects of California's reality, to look at the international sources. And just to close out that point, I was talking with the former superintendent of schools of San Diego, for example. If you're a superintendent of schools of San Diego or of Los Angeles, your school population is international.
Absolutely.
I mean, you really have to think of it that way.
You know, I like that. That's true. You do. The book also, Abe, has another point of special richness for the reader, and one that I really hadn't anticipated and did very much appreciate, and that is you give us some history, and you give it's kind of a foundation right at the start. And the way I think about those chapters is that California's had kind of a, if you will, once and future history with this whole question of internationalization and perhaps some degree of ambiguity. Let's take this immigration issue you just mentioned, and you mentioned China earlier, and the Chinese population has been a very vibrant, vital part of California's past, present, and indeed future. But the state's attitudes, just to take that one population, have been schizophrenic. And for example, California needed Chinese labor, welcomed Chinese labor, and then became one of the centers of the anti-exclusionary movement that kept them from coming. So how does that kind of historical dilemma play into all of this?
No, you're absolutely right on, and in fact, I discussed that quite explicitly in Chapter 2, which is called The Making of Global California. California was born with an international DNA. Its population in the mid-19th century, when it became a state, was 45% made up of people born in other countries, not in the other continental United States, but in other countries. This included the Chinese, whom you mentioned, but also lots of other groups. Italians. Bank of America was founded by an Italian immigrant, and so on and so forth. In the course of the 20th century, and as California grew and grew and grew and became the largest state in the country, all of that changed. By the mid-20th century, California was much more integrated with the rest of the United States, with a population only 8% of which was born in other countries. Right. And with the economy, which used to be in the 19th century more linked to the Pacific Rim than to the United States east of the Rockies, believe it or not, it went into much more of a national integration scheme. On immigration, in a way, the first California contribution, so-called, that is, wasn't a positive contribution to national policy, was the exclusionary immigration legislation that you referred to that dealt with immigrants from Asia in that period. But it's also true as recently as 1994, when California has voted California's voters overwhelmingly approved Proposition 187,
Right.
which was an anti-immigration provision really aimed at Mexican and
That never
Central.
became law, though, did it?
It didn't become law because the courts ruled from day one that it
But the sentiment
could
was
not
there.
be. But the sentiment was there, and it contributed to an atmosphere in national policy.
Yeah.
One of the things I really want to take the opportunity to emphasize is I think California is poised now to play a very constructive role in helping to break the national logjam on immigration policy.
We need that.
And the toxic politics
Right.
of immigration. Because in California, we have moved past those attitudes of the early 1990s. People in California understand, I'm not saying unanimously, there are obviously different voices, as you say, but the majority in California, and this is proved in the polls, and I cite them in the book, understand that the future of our state depends on the successful education, improved health, creditworthiness, civic responsibility, and so on of our immigrant population. Right. And I think that is, you were making some remarks at the beginning about California is kind of a leading edge in our history. This is an area where I think this is really likely to take place.
Well, let me just join you and say I hope that as California goes, so goes the nation, as we used to say. There's another aspect, because the book is honest about the complications, and one of the interesting aspects of talking about how complicated this dialogue, if you will, can be is that the way the little tour you take us on of California, the various regions, and it covers it all very, very, very comprehensively. But let me just cite a couple of things. I mean, Los Angeles is already there. I mean, it's a global city. Absolutely. If you just read that and you say that's the 22nd century somehow, and certainly in terms of these subjects, as San Francisco is in its own kind of cultural way. Other regions have their differences. Then we get to San Diego, which is lagging, and some of these particulars. So I wonder, Abe, when you talk about the dialogue, and I understand, as you pointed out, it's not one unified voice we're seeking here, but a rich chorus, if you will, not a cacophony, but a chorus of voices. But would you have this disparity? How is that going to affect what you're talking about?
Well, when I began the book, to be honest, I didn't know very much about California beyond Los Angeles, where I live, and the Bay Area, where I frequently visited. And as I began to get into it and started using the term Global California, several colleagues said, well, you know, what you're talking about is true in Los Angeles. Maybe it's true in the Bay Area, but this is a big state, and, you know, there's no global California. So I did research. I visited the different regions, and I read a great deal. And the fact is that all of the major regions of California, San Diego, Orange County, the Inland Empire, as it's called, the Central Agricultural Valley, they all have a lot at stake in their international relationships, and they're becoming conscious of it. And in a way, I think that's one of the biggest stories that I'm trying to tell in the book. You mentioned San Diego. The book is just barely out, but some of the first reaction has been in San Diego. People in the business and civic leadership saying, hey, this is terrific. We need to get you down here to talk with our civic leaders about, you know, what we can really do to make things happen. I was out in the Inland Empire, so-called, in a place called Rancho Cucamonga the other day, talking with the Economic Development Council of the Inland Empire, which is a place that processes so much of the freight. It's the international trade that comes from Asia is warehoused there and then sent across the country.
Is that what I would think of as Steinbeck country, or which part of California?
No, Steinbeck's more in the Central Agricultural Valley. Right. But I find, you know, these people really understand that their future depends on making international trade work and on improving the infrastructure and solving some of the international negotiating problems and so on.
Well, it bears mention that you're finding those attitudes among people who are, you know, on the nitty-gritty, up day by day dealing with it. It's also true the state has some extraordinary institutions. I mean, the RAND Corporation was established there right after the war. The UN was established in San Francisco just after the war as well. Powerhouse universities, Stanford, UC Berkeley, and many, many others as well. So the institutions have always been there, and what degree of receptivity to your kind of thinking are you finding there?
I think the receptivity is there, and I think there's some excitement about really pursuing these ideas. But interestingly, it's part of an example of this lag. I mean, you mentioned the great universities. California has some of the greatest universities not only in the country but in the world. But centers for international studies and centers for regional studies
Right.
that were established on the East Coast in the 20s and then strengthened and built up very strongly after the Second World War. They didn't get established in California until the late 60s, early 70s, because California really wasn't thinking in those terms. Now, one of the things that these little factoids that you and I are both interested in, 3 campuses in California have more international faculty than any other university in the United States except for Harvard University, which is good company. And California has more international students than any place in the United States. USC, where I teach, University of Southern California, is the absolute largest.
When you say international, you mean students from abroad? Or?
Students from abroad. And that's very important because these international students who come, most of whom go back to their countries, they are natural bridge builders and network builders for the future of international relations. And this is a great asset that California has, that the United States has in general. It's part of what can make us competitive and prosperous in the future, is really investing in those relationships.
Time has come, Abraham Lowenthal, to talk about the mechanism. You know, people watching us, and I hope reading this book after they've watched us, are going to be curious about, okay, Abe, it's a good argument. How does it work? I mean, you're talking about all these, just a brief list has to include academe, business, the cultural community, and all these people that have the interest. So what do they do with it to make what you want to happen?
Well, that, of course, is the key question, because why analyze all this if there's nothing you can do about it?
Nice talk.
And the 5th chapter, the final chapter of the book, is called Building Cosmopolitan Capacity. And basically, I see what can be done in 3 broad areas. The first is to mobilize the congressional delegation to think as a congressional delegation about the international interests of California. And I call on
a bipartisan basis.
On a bipartisan basis, on a statewide basis, and I call on Governor Schwarzenegger, who is himself an international immigrant, and the Speaker of the Assembly to jointly invite the congressional delegation. And I've been talking with several members of the California congressional delegation. I think this may happen, and it would be a breakthrough. Second, I suggest a number of ways in which the state government and local authorities in California, within the constraints of the Constitution, can do things that will advance our international interests with respect to trade, with respect to intellectual property, with respect to immigration, et cetera. Immigration, for example, California can't have its own immigration policy, but it can invest a lot more effort in integration of immigrants, which can be done at the state and local level, and in some ways has to be done at the state and local level. And third, I call on the state in different sectors, in foundations, in non-governmental organizations, in universities, in trade unions, in communities, to build infrastructure to really continue to define our international interests, to build the international networks, to identify ways in which we can convert our assets into something that really advances our own and the country's interests. And I think the atmosphere is ready for that. I'm very pleased that Kevin Starr, who is the foremost historian of California, widely recognized as such, was generous to contribute a foreword to the book. And one of the points he emphasizes is that the atmosphere in California is ready for this kind of thinking.
Yeah, and another point I would add to what you said, because you've put it here for me to read and understand and appreciate, is that California's ties to Mexico and relationship to Mexico is an extremely important part of all of this, and is to be not just encouraged but built. And you have a very innovative idea in here that stands out, if I may say so, among would be the creation of something that I guess we'd have to call a kind of U.S.-Mexican Road Scholarship, which strikes me as truly innovative, kind of a person-to-person, obviously. What's behind that?
Well, I'm delighted that you saw that. Yeah. There's no question that if California were an independent country and had its own foreign policy, Mexico would be one of its 2 or 3 top priorities.
Right.
And likewise, there's no question that Mexico today, even without California being a separate country, thinks of California as a huge priority for all sorts of obvious reasons. And yet the leadership in Mexico, generally speaking, does not know much about California. People in Mexico from who have a lot of talent and go abroad to study, they tend to go to the Ivy League schools. They tend to go to the Northeast of the United States, not much in California. And similarly in the U.S., it's been traditional. The Rhodes Scholars is precisely an investment made a long time ago in assuring that the best and brightest in the United States from diverse groups would get an exposure to the UK and to Europe.
Right.
We don't have that in regard to Mexico. That's not where people go. If we really just tried to develop a cadre of young people on both sides who really knew something and were committed to improving the relationship, that would be a great step forward.
I've got to say, the mention of Mexico reminds me that this is a man who's capable of multitasking and is the co-editor of this fine collection also, The Obama Administration and the Americas, which talks about our relationship with Mexico and indeed the entire region south. And it ties into what we're saying, because obviously a lot of the points we're making here about U.S., Mexico, California, Mexico relate to the region as a whole. A book worthy of discussion in its own right, Abe. You put together with your co-writers here a kind of a very coherent vision of the continent. But it seems to me what you're really saying in all the various articles here is that Latin America, to extend our conversation just a bit, because it's not in crisis, is worthy of our attention right now.
Yes, it's not in crisis, and it doesn't present us with urgent choices, but it affects us in a daily way, in a quotidian way, more than any other region of the world. Mexico especially, but also Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. And I think the Obama administration has exceptional opportunities to build cooperation on a number of shared problems and challenges that face the Americas in an atmosphere in which there's readiness for cooperation.
Well, on this topic, and certainly on the topics relating to global California, I hope that the Obama administration and the rest of us take your advice. It's always excellent. It's always great to have you here, Abe.
Thank you so much, George.
Hope to have you back soon.
Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org, and please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching this week. And thank you, Abe Lowenthal, very, very much.
Thank you. Great.